Welcome back to the Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. As you know, the Fire Break is hosted by Team Wildfire, developing new technologies for putting out fires so that they don't kill people and burn their houses down. Pretty sensible, I think. Well, a lot of news about fire, obviously. One of the best sources of this news is Colleen Hagerty, who's joining us today. Colleen Hagerty is I'm going to call you a disaster tourist. You travel the world covering disasters, um, man-made, natural, and otherwise, and you've provided coverage for BBC, the New York Times. Uh, the list goes on and on, right? If you Google, ColleenHaggerty.com, you're going to see an amazing list. Welcome to the Fire Break. How are you today, Colin?
Thank you. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invite.
You bet. So tell me what you're covering and what you're seeing and what you feel about it. In a
Yes,
word.
so well, there's a lot out there these days. But yes, as you said, I generally cover disasters and have a pretty broad definition of what that entails these days. So wildfire certainly being part of that, as well as hurricanes. Really, anytime FEMA comes in is a time that I am also trying to go to that area and provide coverage. Um, so sorry, my dog got a squeak toy.
I hear it. Is one of the little ducks or something?
She loves the lamb chops. I don't know what it is
Oh,
about them. That
wow.
is an article that somebody somewhere should write. I don't know what they do with them, but we have a bunch
Right.
of them. I think she's gone though. Yes, so I broadly cover disasters, and in the past 8 months or so, I've been on a fellowship reporting on prescribed fire specifically. So it's through the Solutions Journalism Network, and I'm kind of looking at some of the challenges to implementing prescribed fire at a larger scale, as well as some of the potential solutions that communities have put forward to find success in their area.
So I'm going to guess, you know, historical burn strategies, or what do they call them? Indigenous strategies that have been around forever, or one of the
Yes.
areas you're looking at. I'm guessing one of the obstacles would be trust. When the federal government burns down 300,000 plus acres, that makes people a little hesitant to want to try it. What are the other obstacles you're seeing?
Yes, you definitely touched on two really critical areas there. I'm also looking at, just how the conditions that we have today on the ground differ from the past and how that is forcing kind of that reckoning within the Forest Service and other agencies to reconfigure when burn windows exist, and the policies that go into what kind of measurements they're looking at. Soil is something I hear a lot about these days, is soil moisture content. That was not historically as much of a concern as it is now, that we're looking in a lot of regions with drought and having to figure out, okay, so maybe the conditions are all right on the ground today in terms of, like, we have the moisture in the air, we have the right window temperature wise, but what does that soil look like, and what is that impact going to be down the line? So lots of really interesting research going on there, and big questions. And it's always interesting to be reporting on these things while those conversations are happening. So we're really seeing those changes happening on the ground. And as a journalist, it's cool to see sometimes the reporting I'm doing, being used as part of these decision making processes.
Yeah, because we used to think that fire swept across the ground, right, and that the ground itself wasn't going to catch fire. And now, some of these prescribed burns and other burns, actually move underground several meters, and the burn continues. And then it's really hard to put it
Yes.
out when it's underground, with the
Yes, we're seeing that
peat
Canada right
fires.
now. Yeah, from last summer's blazes. I know there's a number of those zombie fires, so to say,
Yeah, right.
that they're dealing with up there.
So, as you grew up in journalism and decided this was your path, what made it disaster? How did that draw you? And
Yeah,
it's obviously began a fantastic career for you.
oh, thank you. It's a good question because it's not a role that you really see in many newsrooms historically. I think we're starting to see a lot more attention on having dedicated reporters who can talk about things like extreme weather events. But certainly when I started off, I don't remember seeing those types of roles exist. So I started off as a general assignment reporter. Um, I was in New York City. I worked for a local TV news station, and I was here when Hurricane Sandy hit. So that was more than a
Uh,
decade ago now.
no way.
And yeah, it's time flies. But I was reporting on Staten Island, which was one of the boroughs that was hardest hit when the storm came through. And I just remember this moment after the storm. I was there when everything was happening, when the power outages began. I drove around like 2 a.m. right after the storm went through was when my shift started. So I just remember going down the street and how eerie it was. It was totally dark. There was all sorts of debris on the road. My cell phone wasn't working. But it was a few days later when I finally had a moment to kind of catch my breath from the coverage I'd been doing that I just realized how much there still was to say. That, I went there thinking I was going to cover this weather event, but that was really just the beginning because for so many people who had been impacted, I mean, their whole lives had changed. There was a before and after from this storm. And working in local news, I had the ability to really follow that. So, have that accountability of saying, okay, where's the money going? Those promises that were made when I was standing on the beach the next day, were those kept? And can we follow whether or not those policies were successful? The people who I met, were they back in their homes? And what did it mean for them to get back there? What kind of steps did they have to take? And it just was a massive learning experience for me. It really opened my eyes to what the system is like for people who are navigating disasters. And yeah, I kind of took a bit of a winding path to come back to it. But when I moved to California for a later staff job I had at BBC News, it was the summer of 2018. So it was a huge summer for wildfires, unfortunately, out here. And again, it was really seeing like some of those same issues that I saw people in New York dealing with after Hurricane Sandy. Of course, we have a very different disaster here, but they're dealing with a similar system. So just the fact that it had been so many years between those two events, they're very different events. I'm on the opposite side of the country, but I can see some of these similarities. It really made me interested in some of the underpinnings to the system and, the need for that kind of ongoing coverage. And of course, as local media really struggles in a lot of areas, it feels important that there's that voice, whether it's local, national, that someone keeps looking at these events. So that's what I've been trying to do ever since.
That's fascinating. And I've been following your career for quite a while, and you really do amazing work.
Thank
And
you.
it seems like the uh, the outcome of Hurricane Sandy was then twofold. Uh, One, it brought you in contact with disaster as an area for coverage, and two, it was pretty widely regarded as the first time anyone cared about Staten Island.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, it was really interesting being there because the local news station I worked for, New York One, if we have
yep.
anyone from the tri-state area here, we had reporters specifically assigned to each borough in New York. So when the storm happened, we had people deployed everywhere. And in the immediate aftermath, it was really difficult to get to Staten Island, but there were those early reports coming out. I mean, we didn't have power there. So it took a minute, but as people started realizing the damage there, it was like you saw all the news cameras come in, you saw all the politicians come in. But in those early days, it was just us and some of the local reporters, like the Staten Island Advance. We just had like a small crew of people out there who were doing all of that reporting. So it was really formative for me as a journalist to see, they call it like the parachute journalism of when the national media comes in. So I think I always try to keep that in mind of remembering, what it's like to be a local journalist in these areas and the responsibilities and challenges that can come with being a national reporter when you're going into places that maybe you don't have that familiarity. Because I remember
Right.
seeing, what that meant for people on the ground, and what it meant for me as a journalist at that moment.
And I guess acting as a host, as a local journalist, hosting the parachute journalists coming in from everywhere else.
Yeah, yeah, to a degree. Yeah, so it's an interesting balance, and I always say I personally think it's really important to have both sides of that. I mean, local journalists can do such great accountability work because they are on the ground, they know the people in the community, they know the areas to go to. But the national media can bring in additional eyeballs for sure that can
Sure.
result in aid, and for any sort of policy change that people are hoping to have, having that national media attention certainly helps, move the needle more on that.
Yeah, and one of the things that happened from moving from Sandy out to California was you were seeing storms and you were seeing fires, but then you were able to put the connection together that these weather phenomena are all related.
Yes. And also, I think, the amount of attention that came to Hurricane Sandy since it was New York City, that was the first time I'd done disaster coverage of a federally declared disaster. So I was sort of like, oh, this is, what happens. It's interesting when you go out to California where there's less of that larger media presence, from, like a New York Times type newsroom. So you really see that it's different, right? Like there's to a degree, I think that belief that, well, California is going to burn. So it takes a certain level of wildfire to maybe get that same type of attention that we got for Hurricane Sandy. So I think that also was really interesting to me to sort of be looking around in California and say like, well, wait, this is, a truly devastating event. Why aren't more people talking about this? And some of it is the coastal bias. And certainly I also try to keep that in mind when I'm looking at disasters that are happening in states that aren't New York or California.
Sure. So you saw that people's expectations about what a disaster might be impacted what the level of coverage might be. So if an earthquake hits California, yeah, so what? They hit all the time, right? But it's when we see these new things happening in places where they don't usually
Yeah.
happen, storms in New York City, or smoke coming down to New York from Canada, as it did last summer. What do you
Yeah.
think the impact is on the sourcing of aid and the sourcing of new response mentality is when we see things happening where they never happened before? Like personally, I thought when I saw New York got blanketed in smoke, I thought, thank goodness, you know, New York will finally realize that there's only one atmosphere, we all share it, and that it's not just a West Coast problem or a Canada problem. Like anyone's problem is everyone's problem.
Yes, last summer was really interesting because I actually happened to be in New York when the smoke came through. And then I was back in California when we had the tropical storm that we had come through in August. So it was just very bizarre to have like the disasters that I'm used to covering on each coast flipped to the other side, that I was dealing with smoke in New York and a tropical storm on the West Coast. Um, and yeah, I think it's really important because it does certainly open those conversations up. I think when we saw that smoke, I know it was in Washington, D.C. as well. So you had members of Congress who were commenting on it. So I think those moments of awareness are really critical in helping people recognize that you can't outrun disasters, that, like you said, we're all sharing this planet, and whether or not you can see it, it's there. It also was interesting as a journalist to see the types of stories that were coming out around it. And I think there's also something really great happening in journalism where there is more connecting of the dots between events and trying to not just say, oh, you're dealing with smoke, this is it. Like I know I saw some California outlets putting articles out and saying, hey, if you're in New York, like here's what we've been doing out here, here's what's been successful, here's how you can try to mitigate smoke in your home on a budget. You know, we have people in San Francisco who are used to apartment living who say, like, here's how I do it, because maybe advice from someone who has a home isn't relevant to you as a renter in New York. So I really appreciated seeing that connection made between, different areas that are dealing with, because I think that was something when I talk about the relationship between my coverage of Hurricane Sandy and the wildfires in California, like I continuously see communities dealing with the challenges of navigating the post disaster period. And a lot of times they can feel really alone. It can feel like no one has dealt with this process. And I think we're starting to see a lot of outreach from disaster impacted communities and from news outlets in those communities trying to help connect the dots and say, like, hey, we've been through this before. Here's where you might run into some issues. And here's, kind of like our tried and true methods of trying to deal with that.
And how do people consume that news at the time? How do they gain access in the midst of a fire or a storm?
Yeah, of course, there's the tech challenges of if you have power in those moments. I'm doing some reporting right now on emergency alerts and warnings, so it's very top of mind for me to be thinking about those tech challenges. I I really hear social media a lot, and I think we're in an interesting moment right now where some of those more dominant social media platforms are maybe kind of losing some users, and especially with younger generations, we're seeing new platforms come up, and I'm not totally sure if there's like a strong understanding of the role that's playing into the information cycle during extreme weather events and disasters. But I know there's a lot of research on it. I remember there being so much with Twitter back in the day where people were looking and saying, how is that impacting both the news people get and the aid that they're able to receive? I've done reporting in the past on Facebook, and while I know Facebook is a less popular platform these days, I still see a lot of engagement around Facebook groups that are related to disasters. And I mean, some of the ones that I've been in for 5 or 6 years with people, and they're still really active because the recovery process is really long. And also, a lot of areas that are impacted by a hurricane or wildfire, they're probably still facing some threat. Even if it's not a wildfire that might come to their area because they have that kind of burned perimeter, they're still in a region where maybe they're dealing with smoke. And for people who have experienced wildfire, that can be a really difficult event to deal with. So just having that community to talk about, okay, we're going to see smoke. Is this a wildfire nearby? Is this a prescribed fire? And having those conversations with people, I think, is really helpful for them. But yeah, social media, I think, is a big one. And then, of course, I hope people are looking at the news as well.
Yeah, right. And I imagine the sentiments that people have around different platforms will
Yeah,
will be of impact too, right? That people may have left Facebook in search of
right.
Instagram and you know TikTok, but
Yes, TikTok.
right,
I've seen
right,
a lot of before some hurricanes in recent years, there's like a lot of like prep for this hurricane with me videos, which I find
yeah,
fascinating, where people are saying like, here's my extra water source and here's my flashlight. And I mean, really helpful, I think, in some way for people to see what these preparations look like from like a real person and not just a journalist or official, someone who looks relatable to like an average TikTok scroller. But it's just like a one of those moments where you're kind of like, this is a little dystopic because it's like usually you see get ready with me, it's someone putting makeup on for the day. And in this case, it's
yeah, right.
like they're stockpiling their belongings.
Yeah, and probably you see some migration back to Facebook for the familiarity. Like I want to go be at my parents' house, right? And
Yeah, I don't think there's another outlet that has captured the ability to do Facebook groups in the same way. And that really, for information sharing, has been a critical source in so many communities I've followed. I mean, it's tens of thousands of people who join these groups. And especially, I know a lot of FEMA has Facebook pages. A lot of times there's like pop-up pages that agencies will pull together for wildfires to put out information. But with our disaster system being the local, state, national system that it is, sometimes local emergency management agencies don't have the capacity to be updating social media as often. So I think especially in those kind of more rural areas where they are a bit underserved by the amount of information maybe they're able to receive quickly, which is really key in those moments. Facebook is huge, and you see these people who take on the massive role of moderating communities of tens of thousands of people, trying to keep them updated. And I am always fascinated by the ability of someone to not only survive a disaster and be dealing with the after effects of that in their own lives, but then take on the responsibility of saying, I will moderate this Facebook group, because moderating a Facebook group is a daunting experience that I personally don't have the stomach for.
And there's other, moderated platforms such as Watch Duty,
Yeah.
which are specific apps just for staying up to date with what's going on with disasters.
Yes, the watch duty
So,
model is a really fascinating one. I've done some coverage of that for Popular Science in the past, like right when they launched. I reported on watch duty, and I mean, that was not that long ago. And it's really
no,
incredible how popular it's become and widespread. I know they just launched over in Texas. I
right, on
believe
an
as,
emergency
yeah,
basis, right? They just
yeah. So it's
rolled it out.
clearly that need is there of a place for people to get that information quickly. And again, that for me goes back to my reporting on alerts and warnings and some of the challenges in that system that exist.
So alerts and warnings are, right at they're right in the middle, right? The disaster happens, then the alerts go out, then the response happens. So that's that middle moment there. Let's go back more towards the cause side, because we can have more impact on the cause side than we have on, the effect side. What are the drivers right now that you think, we can impact? So we have less alarms and less responses and less recoveries required.
Yes, I mean, a big question. There's certainly a lot of conversation around that right now. In my reporting on prescribed fire, that of course is one of the reasons that a lot of state and federal agencies are looking to increase the acres that they're burning, whether it's through prescribed fire or managed fire, being allowing some fires to burn rather than putting them out instantly if they believe there could be some ecological benefit and there isn't the risk to communities. So I think that's a big one that, certainly there's a lot of funding and attention being put towards that. I know there's a lot of conversation even within the federal government with the Wildfire Commission, where they put out a ton of recommendations on that. In California, I know there's some really difficult conversations around development and where people are building from here. I just I have a newsletter about disasters, and I just spoke with a local journalist up in the Chico area who has been reporting on a development that was on the ballot for them during this past primary election, and it was whether or not they could have a large housing development put in a space that had been burned by the campfire that is still in the wildland urban interface area, and whether that was going to be safe. And the developer said, we'll become a firewise community. We will prepare people to understand what the risks are. We will do our best to mitigate it to the best of our ability. Um, but it was a tough conversation because it's an area that also has been impacted by a number of fires in the region. So there is an issue of housing affordability. So has been an uptick in homelessness over the past 5 years. They need housing. But the question was really like, is this the place to do it? So it's really difficult. And they ended up in that area. California, we are slow to count our votes. We have a very in-depth process, but all signs are pointing towards that not being put through. So yeah, I think that is a huge one as well, is, how much can we mitigate through actions of things like prescribed burning? Of course, there's the roots of climate change and needing to address what we're doing in that sense. But looking at the situation we have on the ground and the knowledge that there's only so much in the short term we can do to impact the climate, where are we going, and what sort of information are those communities having, and how prepared can we be? I think that's still a challenge.
Yeah, and what is the impact benefit of doing everything we can? Because there's areas where you've done everything you can, and it's still not going to make much difference. And I wonder, if we were to compare like a Firewise community, okay, I cleaned my gutters, I moved everything 5 feet away from my house, I cut my trees down, I got rid of my ladder fuels. You know, does this mean now, when the big wildfire comes, I can just sit here and I'll be fine? Probably not, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think
It's
there's,
just like say, oh, we're an earthquake safe community. Like what? Because I screwed my cabinet to the wall. Like, that doesn't mean my house isn't going to fall down.
right. It's that risk always remains and it's impossible to get away from in some senses. I was doing some reporting at the start of the year on earthquakes and those resiliency measures, as you mentioned, and it's really interesting because something I wasn't actually that aware of before is that when you're talking about building codes and standards, it's not always because it hits this standard, your house will stay up and it's fine. It's like they are just trying to do the bare minimum to keep it from collapsing in on you. So it doesn't necessarily mean if your building is up to the highest code that it is not going to be a huge cost for you to fix it afterwards. It just means it has hit this sort of bare minimum standard. So what I heard from researchers doing that is we've certainly increased our ability to test. There's such crazy looking work being done at IBHS and in Florida, where they have like these walls of wind, where they have ember cannons. So they're really putting structures through the ringer in test environments, but then real life environments always come with their own surprises. So there's only so much we can do. And unfortunately, we learn the most from disasters. I was speaking with researchers in Japan who were going out and looking at structures that collapsed during the earthquake they had on New Year's Day. Um, Japan is done incredible work in terms of trying to be more resilient to earthquakes and having some of the most advanced standards in the world, but buildings are still going to collapse and it's also can be really costly to make these changes. Costly and it can take a lot of time to educate yourself to understand what to do. So that can be a really big burden on communities and that can create inequity in who is able to even take those steps to maybe have their home survive or understand the right time to go and where to go because it's just from the work I've done. I mean, you see the stacks of paperwork that it takes to really understand what's going on and it's a lot if you are a person who has a family and a job and maybe can't dedicate that mental space.
Yeah, right. And there's always going to be that trade-off when you get recommendations from building codes or IBHS.
Yeah.
You know, like what is a reasonable amount of work and budget to put into any given code level, right?
Yes.
We could all build nuclear silos and live underground in them and probably survive pretty much anything that came along, but that might be a little cost prohibitive for people. So we have to say, like, at what point, have we hit that optimal spot where it's affordable and provides the benefit we're looking for?
Yes, exactly.
Right. Right. And we're going to go off the record for 1 second here. So what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, is I'd like to close this interview up now
Sure.
and just have you throw a different shirt on, and then we'll come back for a second episode.
Oh, sure.
If you have another half an hour, because I'd love to do two hits with you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So here we'll go back on the record now. Colleen, absolutely fascinating chatting with you, and what an amazing career you've built covering something that's really an important phenomenon now. Thanks so much for joining me today. If people want to follow your material, what do you recommend? There's so many places we
Yes.
could follow you, right? My World's on Fire.
Yes, I always just direct people straight to my website because everything is on there. So that's ColleenHagerty.com. And there's a subscribe form to my newsletter on there, which is free. It is 3 weeks every month. You'll get an edition. And then I have all my social media on there too. I try to be on each new platform as it pops up. So whichever one you're on, hopefully I'm on there too.
Wonderful. Colleen, thank you again so much. Great chatting with you and really wonderful learning. And I love the fact that you publish to your website rather than having to wait for publications to pick you up. You're putting all the news out there as you develop it. So thanks again so much. Well, folks,
Thank you.
you've been watching and hopefully enjoying a lovely half hour with Colleen Hagerty. My World's on Fire is the column where I first discovered Colleen, and I've been following her for quite a long time. Recommend that you go check her out. Subscribe. You know that thing where they point down, subscribe, link, like. I don't know how to do all that stuff, but I do. I know how to say it anyway. So that's it. You've been watching The Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. We're sponsored by Team Wildfire. Join us again next time. Until then, take care.